And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 25 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I want to talk about the invasion of Greece by Benito Mussolini. And it's a much controversial decision by Benito why he would attack the Greece. Of course, this is after World War II breaks out, and there's been much discussion as to why he made this decision. It's been one of those things in history that many people have critiqued. It's that moment where Benito gets his uh, criticisms for being sort of the conqueror. Benito wanted to take land and being the aggressor in World War II. And this fits in sort of that Western liberal caricature of the aggressive nature of fascism and puts him in that sort of same camp with, of course, the failed Austrian painter, as the Axis powers were painted as aggressors. And I think to a certain degree, that's true, right? But in how we contextualize it, I think is very interesting as well, too. Now, recently, Zoomer historian did a video on this, covering this topic, entitled the 1941 invasion of Greece. And he goes through the different policies and decisions as to why, and goes through the significance of the battles that took place there and how that shaped out in the sort of the discourse and how it all played out in World War II. And I think, while I'm a big fan of Zoomer historian, I think in this one here, I think he might have underscored a little bit as to the reasons why Benito decided to go into Greece a little bit. He's quoting out of the Nicholas Farrell book, and I have the Nicholas Farrell book, and I think it's a great book on Mussolini. I highly recommend it. And Nicholas Farrell sums it up basically. This is part of Mussolini's kind of thing of fear and greed. On the one hand, he has the fear of Hitler and always trying to stay ahead of Hitler or a distance from Hitler or try to appease Hitler in whatever he can. And then there's always that greed part of Mussolini where, he has his ambitions for his own Italian empire. In the case of Albania and Greece, which are different because Albania was always an Italian protectorate. There's other things going on there, right? But in Greece, Farrell calls it a parallel strategy that Mussolini was trying to maintain. As Hitler was trying to expand out during World War II, take different territories, Mussolini always believed that he had to parallel Hitler and kind of show an initiative that he had a certain amount of strength too, so Hitler wouldn't become too powerful. Now, it's an interesting thesis, and I think it's a thesis that it works, I think, historically in many ways, because the conundrum that Mussolini always had was, after he was isolated from the Allies, he's forced into this camp with Hitler. The fear of having Italy overrun was very real. Now, when we look at this thing about Greece and the aggressive nature of Mussolini going into Greece, how serious of an aggressive action was it? Because Nicholas Farrell does note that Mussolini wasn't preparing for war at any time. Not only did he try to stay out of war, but there was no significant increase in military spending. In fact, when he finally makes the call to go into Greece, he has the same kind of military spending, the same numbers as he did, in a time of peace. It's not like Hitler that's been gearing up and spending money now, 4, 5, 6 years earlier, where he has this master plan, to conquer back whatever it is Hitler wants, and that was mainly in the East. For Mussolini, he had somewhat of an aggressive policy, somewhat, but it was always more on the fly. He always wanted to keep Italy out of war. Obviously, things like happened in Ethiopia, places like that, but even that was a decision made in sort of a reaction to circumstances that broke down on the ground. In the case of Ethiopia, it was the attack on Walla Walla, right? An Italian post, and the Ethiopians seizing citizens and slaves from Somaliland, Italy, and taking them back. And there were some violations of international law that was going on there, and ultimately a battle with the British. But even with Ethiopia, it wasn't a plan that went back any number of years that he had planned to conquer. It was always an issue in Italy. Ethiopia was a sore kind of thing with the Italians going back to the first Ethiopian war about 20 years earlier. But again, as we're gearing up to go to Greece, I don't know if it's so much of a war plan of conquest as military spending doesn't suggest any of that. So you got to keep these things in mind. And so for me, I always try and get to the source, because we always hear about the other side of the story, right? Especially from the classical liberal side, and we get the basic narrative. And I think there could be some truth to that. I think Mussolini has some ambitions to expand the Italian empire. But the question is, how far was he willing to go? The problem, of course, with Greece is that in many ways, it was a British proxy. And I think that's what presented the biggest problem for the Italians. And in effect, reading here Luigi Villari's book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini, the plan was really conceived by Galazzo Ciano, which was Mussolini's son-in-law, one of his top diplomats, one of his top ministers. It was Galazzo that pushed the policy to go both into Albania and Greece. And the way he saw it was that you cannot have, basically a British proxy in the Mediterranean controlling influence, especially after the British had already started to create embargoes against Italy and really sucking out the lifeblood of the Italian economy through its maritime, trading of imports and exports. That was already a problem. Particularly, Villari notes that it was the shipments of coal that were coming via the ocean, the sea, from Germany down to Italy. That was already a problem that the British Navy was already blockading, creating havoc to the Italian economy. So there's a precedence here of an aggressive nature by the British, who, have this great naval empire, right? They control the oceans and the seas. That's how they maintain this great empire. That's already causing problems for the Italian economy, even before we get to Greece. You couple that with the fact that you got Greece that's already a proxy of the British. Remember, their king was British, King George of Greece. He was an Englishman, the king of Greece was. The political class was heavily influenced by the English. It was a British proxy. And so the question now is, if your sphere of influence is the Mediterranean, which is Italy's, and you got the British down there that's interrupting your trade routes, what do you do about that? Especially Italy, because if you look at it geographically, it's so dependent on trade by the seas. And listen, the Italians had a formidable navy, don't get me wrong, but when shipments are coming from long distances and you got the long reach of the British naval force blockading things like coal that are coming in because Italy lacks these natural resources, you got a problem all of a sudden. Let's remember, it was Franklin Roosevelt that put an embargo on Italy in 1937. This is what forced Italy to go to Hitler and the Germans ultimately to get their supplies, mainly the coal, steel, the oil. And the moment the British now put a blockade on that, Italy is left stranded economically. It's stranded without resources. It's got big problems because it's so dependent on trade and controlling the oceans around it. And this is where the big debate came up about what do we do with this? How do we survive now that we're in the midst of a war? And what we know is that the Greeks were giving the British bases in their lands, in their territory. Now, I know in Zoomer Historian, he kind of underscores this, says, well, something about British bases, but it's kind of a big deal. And as I read Luigi Villari's book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini, he says it was a big deal. Now, let's remember who Luigi Villari is. He's a primary source. He worked in the Mussolini regime. He was a diplomat that traveled back and forth to England and America, right? And after the war in 56, he published his book, sort of laying out the case, trying to get the record straight about what the regime was trying to do and give the Italian point of view. And there was a concern by the Italians after the blockades happened that British influence in the Mediterranean was going to be a problem. Let's remember the big debate that Mussolini and Hitler had. Mussolini always told Hitler, we have to protect the Mediterranean because that's where the British are going to come from. That's where you're going to get an attack from, ultimately from the south. Hitler never wanted to believe that. Hitler never understood the importance of the Mediterranean. Now, for a nation like Germany that's landlocked, you could understand that. This is why the Germans never really had a huge navy. Even after the English betrayed the Italians at the Stresa conference, they agreed to give Germany something like 35 or 40% of the size of the navy that the British had. The navy, the British weren't sweating it because Germany never really built a big navy. You need some of it, obviously, for imports, exports, things of that nature. But the Germans historically always like to stay landlocked. This is why even when it came to the Air Force, the Germans didn't build a top-end Air Force like, for example, the Americans or the British would. They didn't build a top-end Navy because they didn't have a lot of access to the oceans, the seas. What was the primary force behind the German military? It was the army. It was the infantry. It was the tank divisions. It was the ground troops because they were determined to go east and stay landlocked. But for Mussolini in the south, his warning to Hitler was, listen, this is where they're going to come from. They're going to come with ships. They're going to land on territories over here, and they're going to work up the Italian peninsula. The Mediterranean is key. It's key for trade, but it's also key to disrupt the British trade routes because their whole economy, their worldwide empire depends on them going through the Suez Canal. And so if you're going to kind of cut off the economic lifeblood of the British economy, you better be able to control the Mediterranean. But Hitler never saw that. So while Mussolini wanted to focus on the Mediterranean and focus on Britain and taking their power away in the Mediterranean, Hitler wanted to go east toward Russia. That's where he put his emphasis on. And it's interesting because even Nicholas Farrell says, when you look at the debate between Hitler and Mussolini, he says, while Mussolini made some mistakes and that decision going into Greece was a terrible mistake on his part, he was probably right on the overall debate. If Hitler would have actually focused more on the Mediterranean region than going east, the Axis powers would have had a good chance to really win that war. Because let's remember, the other problem you have is you have the Italian colonies in North Africa. If you don't control the Mediterranean there, and you're allowing the British to coexist with you to a certain degree, and really coexist is tough because while the Italian Navy was strong, it was never as strong as the British Navy. How are you going to maintain those colonies in North Africa? And this is exactly what happened later on. Once the African front of the war started, the Italian and the German military were outnumbered. They could not get their equipment back and forth in an efficient manner because of the battles of the seas. Mussolini always understood this. So the question becomes now, what about Greece, right? And what do we do with Greece with that matter? Um, so you have this situation now where you have to deal with this. Now, there's another part of the story that makes this even more intriguing. And this comes from, again, the Luigi Villari book. The other reason why Mussolini wanted to go into not only Albania and Greece, but also Yugoslavia was to protect it from German influence. Remember, the Germans had taken Austria through the Anschluss, and the next logical move would have been to go into Yugoslavia and eventually Greece. Also, Hitler was going toward Bulgaria or Hungary. Which one was it now? One of those two that had lots of oil fields. So you had what are called the secret correspondence, right? The Mussolini-Churchill papers, which is, of course, now in history considered a grand conspiracy because those papers were most likely destroyed when Mussolini was captured by the communist partisans and eventually put to death. Those documents were probably destroyed. I got a whole book on that conspiracy. And so people are going to say, Frank, that's a conspiracy theory. Maybe, but it's important enough for Villari to mention it. And one of the things that Villari mentions is that in the dialogue between Churchill and Mussolini before Churchill became prime minister was Churchill encouraging Mussolini to go into Yugoslavia, into Albania, and even into Greece to remove, again, Hitler's influence from that region. Because the last thing that the British wanted was for Hitler to conquer all this territory with all these resources. Again, Mussolini and Churchill were on good terms. Were on good terms. It was politics that separated them to a certain degree. But according to Villari, Mussolini's idea of going into that region in many ways was already cemented by Churchill even long before, well, I don't say long before, but before Churchill became prime minister. There was many strategic reasons as to go in there. One, you had the British influence in Greece, the British bases. Greece was a proxy, but on the other hand, you had to protect yourself from Hitler because the fear always was that Hitler would at some point invade Italy, and effectively kind of be like that another Polish front, the way the Germans treated Poland during World War II as well too. And Mussolini always understood this. It's one of the reasons why he sided with Hitler when pushed away from the Allies, because he was isolated. It was a situation where the Allies have abandoned me. I'm all alone here. I can't take him out by myself. I could at least buy some time in regards to signing an alliance with them. And guess what? After Franklin Roosevelt cut off the resources, natural resources to Italy, how was Italy going to survive without those natural resources? It wasn't. It became a natural alliance because of geopolitics. But Villari is interesting here. Now, let me read a section here of Villari's book, and so I can best contextualize this to you, okay? The fear of entering too late emanated even from circles connected with the court. The king himself, who at first had been by no means an interventionist, feared that through the temporizing attitude of his prime minister, Italy risked arriving when the table was cleared. According to the chief of the political police, already quoted, this state of public opinion, if it was not the determining cause of Italy's intervention, was certainly one of the most important and contributory causes. Quote, responsibilities for the final decision should then be equally distributed between the crown, the government, and the people. Mussolini thus found himself faced with the gravest of crises of his life and in the whole history of his country. If things went well, that would assure Italy's position and his own triumph as the maker of the new Italy. If they went ill, it would mean disaster for his country, the end of the fascist regime, ruin, and perhaps death for himself. This last was the least of his considerations. for it was the country, above all, about which he was most deeply anxious. He would have been glad to see Italian aspirations realized in an atmosphere of friendship with Great Britain and France. But during the preceding 5 years and more, he had found in those quarters nothing but suspicion, hostility, and petty jealousy, veiled or open. And he had become even more convinced that the two Western powers were determined to keep Italy in a state of perpetual subjugation. Evidence of this was seen in the guarantees given to, though not asked for by Romania and Greece, in the Anglo-Turkish treaty, and above all in the Anglo-French military alliance. The strangling methods lately applied to Italian seaborne trade put the lid on. Great Britain, he fully realized, never forgave an injury and would not forgive its diplomatic defeat over Ethiopia. Now that France seemed ready to make concessions to Italy, it was still the British government that held up any attempt of the kind. We may ask ourselves, what was the alternative for Italy except to throw in its lot with Germany and intervene on Germany's side in the war? Italy might, it is claimed, have remained neutral to that end of the conflict or else joined the Western powers. Had Italy chosen the first course, it would sooner or later have been subjugated to ever increasing pressure by both sides. In the end, owing to its geographical situation, it would have had an ultimatum from the Allies and or from Germany to join one side or the other, or at least to allow the Allied or the German armed forces to make use of its territory. If Italy refused, it would have been invaded and devastated by the victors, wherever they were, as vanquished, cowardly, and contemptible nation, and been deprived of all of its colonies and perhaps of a large part of its metropolitan territory. Had Italy chosen the second alternative, its fate might well have been that of Poland, an immediate German invasion with all its disastrous consequences and much help as Poland had received from the Western powers, exactly none at all. You see, guys, this is the situation they faced. This is the situation Italy faced. It was a no man's land. As I have been saying on the series that I've been doing for a long time now, whatever side it chose, it was going to be wrong because of its geographical location and because of ideological differences as well, too. You got to remember, you can't forget that this was the era of democracy, the era of freedom and liberty. And so there was always going to be an inherent bias by the Western powers because of the governmental structure, because of a superiority complex that Western liberal Protestant nations believed they had over a system like Italy's that they couldn't control. Even though the Italians were fine with it, it wasn't fine for the Western liberal elites that believed that they knew better. That bias existed. That those political decisions played out based on polling data throughout the negotiation process of where Italy was going to go in the lead up to World War II. We can't ever forget that. There was a great arrogance that came from the Western liberal republics because of this superiority complex. And here you could see, right? The British were not a forgiving nation. The British were still upset over Ethiopia. The British used their war and subjugated Turkey under their dictates, right? After a war was fought against them, and they basically dictated their terms and conditions, which Turkey would have been another problem because it's right next door to Greece, right? Right. My point is that the British had a lot of influence in that region. Turkey, Greece, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they have Malta as well too, because that was the question that a lot of people asked. Well, instead of going after Greece, why not go after Malta? You know, you would have, you would have threw a monkey wrench into the British Empire's, sort of naval based decisions and what they needed to do there. And maybe that's a great question. I don't know why they chose Greece, right? Could it have been the fear and greed? Could it have been that Mussolini needed that big victory in order to feed his own ego, as some people have suggested? That's very possible. I'm not removing the idea that Mussolini had an ego to a certain degree, especially as Hitler is conquering territories. But could it have been over the fact that Hitler was conquering territory? And as Nicholas Farrell suggests, there was a parallel strategy there that he felt he had to meet with, you know? In the end, Mussolini makes that decision, and that is to go into Greece, in a disastrous decision that it was. He picked the wrong time of the year to go in. Hitler tried to warn him about reconsidering the date. It was snowy, wet time of the year. Equipment got bogged down, and the Italians got bogged down, and they suffered heavy losses. Many people point out the fact that Mussolini might have been arrogant. He thought it would be a short victory in Greece, that he would be drinking coffee somewhere in Greece, and people make fun of that notion because they got bogged down, they got beat back, and eventually it was the Germans that had to come in and defeat the Greeks, and take that territory over. You know, again, this is war. I'm not making a moral judgment one way or the other. For me, whenever two Christian nations go to war with one another, that's a great tragedy. And the Greeks, being an Orthodox nation, granted, not Catholic but Orthodox, there's still some common bonds there with Catholics, and that in and of itself is a shame. But I think the fact that Greece was a British proxy, effectively a Protestant proxy, is what complicated that relationship. And so that's why I think Mussolini went in there. Was it right or wrong? I don't know. I don't know. You know, it just, what is for me, it was always going to be a war of great retribution at the end of the day, because it was going to be a war about resources just as much as anything else. When you got a nation like America that has all the resources it needs on its own territory, the British have their empire all over the world, they get resources, and the Russians have an unlimited amount of resources. These smaller Axis power nations that lack resources, they were going to need to go get them. And so they were always going to look like the invading aggressive force, without a doubt. That was going to be the nature of it at the end of the day. That war ultimately was about the dominance of the main sort of powers of the world at the time, fighting against the lower powers that were looking to alleviate themselves, I guess, from the stronger powers. And resources was always going to be a part of that in a post-industrial civilization. War is always regrettable in every way, and you wish that life was a lot more clean. You wish that this world war never broke out, but it did. And based upon what you need, decisions were made there. I think for Mussolini, you know, whether that was more morally prudent, whether that was right for the war efforts, I can't judge that. I'm not a military guy. But I think in some ways, the way I see it, you could understand why he went into Greece. I don't necessarily think it was about conquest per se. Not that I rule out the egotistical aspect of that and celebrating a victory, showing that he's an alpha, just like the failed Austrian painter or the other Western liberal empires. But the fact that the British were there, you needed to block that British influence from the Mediterranean. It kind of makes sense to me. Some historians want to downplay it and say it was just an aggressive act, maybe, but if the Greeks were a proxy of the British, it was going to be a problem if you're going to defend the Mediterranean, have your trade routes blocked, and try and survive that war. It was unfortunate. It turned out to be a disaster for Mussolini in Italy. And really, the moment they got bogged down in Greece, the war efforts, I think both Mussolini and Hitler realized that Italy wasn't prepared for this war. Again, they weren't even building for a war. That's the strange thing about all of this, is that Mussolini didn't have a wartime economy that he was even building. He had no intention on doing this, but once the war broke out, he had what he had, and he dealt, with the cards that he was dealt. And it's a shame. And that effort in Greece really cemented the doom of the Italian military in that war. It angered Hitler a lot, obviously. Hitler felt that it might have compromised the war if Mussolini didn't go into Greece, or would have been more patient with it in time, that Hitler wanted to go to Russia. He felt that because he had to bail Mussolini out of Greece, it took away from the Russian campaign. Because what Mussolini's action did is it brought the war into the Russian sphere of influence. And now the Russians are seeing, wait a minute, now we're in Yugoslavia, which is heavy communist, right? Bulgaria, Romania, large areas that would eventually become communist, that already have lots of Soviet influence there. The Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, now realize in their sphere of influence, they have to start gearing up. I think the idea, according to Hitler, was if Mussolini stayed out of Greece, that Hitler can go and attack Russia and have an easier time over there. Now, I question that as well, too, because the winter eats up everybody in Russia because it's such a mass geographical territory and it's brutal into winter. But that was Hitler's idea. But as Nicholas Farrow notes, on the flip side of that, it might have been better for Hitler to take Mussolini's advice, and that is defend the Mediterranean rather than going into Russia. Though it's interesting that despite Hitler's anger at Mussolini's decision, Hitler still did not throw Mussolini under the bus because of the admiration that Hitler always had for Mussolini. And I know that when Germany attacked France and Italy went in there with them through the sort of the Alps, Hitler said that while the Italian troops didn't do very well against France in the Alps, the fact that the Italians and Mussolini occupied the French in the Alps allowed Germany to go into France a lot easier. And so for Hitler, he was always appreciative of what Mussolini did with France, despite being ineffective. Again, the Italian military was ineffective. I mean, I say that, in a way where that doesn't mean that there wasn't moments that the Italian military, wasn't good. And there was. I mean, they had a good Navy. They also had special forces that were excellent. They had a special sort of Navy SEAL force. They used these tiny subs in the water that blew up lots of ships. I mean, they were effective in their own way, but when it came down to it, they just didn't have the capacity, the might, and then ultimately the resources for the equipment they needed to really be prepared for this war. Again, they weren't preparing for the war. Mussolini's grand strategy was to stay out of it until the diplomatic aspect kind of broke down. So Mussolini's invasion of Greece, it's seen as one of those dark moments, black eyes in the history of this aggressive character. And maybe that's the case. That's how people want to qualify it as. That's fine. I see it as just a byproduct of war. It was going to be what it was going to be. It was going to be a mad rush for resources. And I think with the British in that area and Greece being a proxy of the British, I think there's a case to be made that Mussolini might have had a good reason. So there you have it. Mussolini in Greece turned out to be a disaster. I want to thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank signing off. Frank is speaking. Good night, everybody.